and I'd like to acknowledge the strength and resilience of Wurundjeri people and of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples everywhere. All right, so welcome again to everyone. Thank you again all for coming. So if you haven't been to one of these before, we've essentially open sourced a mini version of a brand new GAMSAT mock exam that we've written for our students. So we're just going to let you guys sit it in real time. And at the end of each section, our tutors are going to give you some live feedback and you're going to get some results. So this is now the 6th mini mock that we're putting on. And our past students just keep asking us for them. So according to our previous cohort, this next 2 hours is what they would say is one of the most valuable free resources for preparation, because you just get so much real hands-on experience with what the exam is going to be like. So even though you're going to be technically going to be sitting an exam, it's very different to a real exam because we want this to feel really casual. So please feel free to ask any questions that you have at any time in the chat. We're more than happy to answer all your questions. And as you will see in a minute, we have all of our specific section tutors that can answer anything you want to know about any given section or about the GAMSAT in general. So that brings me to the chat. So if you haven't already, can you guys please all open up the chat function? This is where I'm going to be sending through all the links for you guys to access the question booklets and the essay submission links for tonight. And I'll also be sending through your results after you finish each section in the chat. So to get us started, can everyone who has not heard of Halad before, please send a thumbs up in the chat. Okay, so I'm just going to give you guys a quick intro to Halad just before we spend the next 2 hours together. So the first thing to know about Halad is that even though this is obviously a GAMSAT session and we will be doing a GAMSAT mini mock today, we are not just a GAMSAT company. So if you're not from Melbourne, you may not have heard of us because we only just started as a not-for-profit just about a year ago. And now we run Australia's most affordable GAMSAT and med interview tuition services. And with that, what we do internationally is we actually provide some of the most disadvantaged communities in rural Philippines with free health education. So as you can see in the picture in the yellow shirt, that's one of my really good friends, Gabby, who was one of the student volunteers selected to go and teach in rural Philippines earlier this year. And we love running these GAMSAT services, not just because we love seeing you succeed, but also because all of the proceeds that we make from our GAMSAT and med interview tuition services go straight towards this cause in the Philippines. So to date, we've had over 2,200 GAMSAT students come through one of our tuition services, and that's helped us raise over $20,000 for our cause. So thank you so much to everyone who has donated before attending tonight, because it really does make a difference and it goes to help those who need it the most. So in saying all of that, there is nothing more rewarding to us than seeing you guys succeed. Not even kidding. Our whole team literally celebrates every time we see a student improve, no matter how big or small. And I can guarantee that after these next 2 hours together, you'll see that there's no one else who wants to get you into med or dent more than our tutors here. So you can see some testimonials from our students on the screen who have improved from 10 to 20 points for their GAMSAT scores. So just before we jump into the technicalities of how tonight is going, there's just one last thing to mention, which is that, you know, we obviously really want you guys to succeed on the GAMSAT and to improve on your scores and to get into med. But getting into med and being a good doctor is not just about marks. And what we really value at Halad is giving back and focusing on the kind of doctor and person that you want to become. So our tutors all care not only about getting your marks up, but also about you as a person. And we really hope that you're able to approach your preparation with the mindset of becoming the best healthcare professional that you can be, rather than just as a way of meeting sort of an arbitrary score cutoff. So I guess for me, you know, one of my peer tutors this year mentioned to us that once you get into med, it's no longer the same as for your undergrad, where you could just put your whole life and your well-being and everything that matters to you on hold around exam time just to make those marks that you need. Once you get into med, you're actually beginning the career that you're going to have for the rest of your life, and you want to be adopting habits that will carry you through. And, you know, I think the earlier that you can kind of get into that mindset, the better it will be for you and the happier and healthier you will be. So I'm actually just going to play a few seconds of insight from Mark, who was one of our September GAMSAT sitters. It was his first time sitting the GAMSAT, and he came through this exact mini mock and a few of our courses and scored an 80 on his first go. But actually what we're most proud of is, of course, his score an improvement, but even more so, the mindset shift of becoming a better person and medical professional for others. So I'm just going to play the video for you guys now.
Like, you guys went on from organization, like, and I think that was a really cool thing. It's like, and you could see it from like instantly, like, these are people who genuinely want people to get into medicine. And like, that was like, it's actually, I think it's kind of changed my thought process. It's like, if I were to get into medicine, I would definitely want to be like that, as opposed to like, everyone's fighting for these spots, like, stuff you guys, like, I'm not gonna, you know, I want to get in, not you. And so I think that was very.
So just before we start with the questions as well, I just want to give a bit of an introduction for everybody. So I'll start with myself. So I'm Jules, and I'm the events manager for Halad, which means I'm the person who's going to be behind the scenes helping with the tech side of things tonight, send you guys the links, making sure that you get the absolute most out of today. So just a little bit more about me. I've just finished my first year of med at Melbourne Uni this year. And when I sat the GAMSAT, I actually personally couldn't really afford to go through any of the GAMSAT companies. They were just too expensive. And, you know, I always found that really unfair that there's such an accessibility barrier with doing courses for GAMSAT practice. And so aside from being really passionate about the work that we do in the Philippines, one of the main things that really made me want to get involved and volunteer with Halad is the fact that we run such affordable courses. So I'm now going to move on to introducing Sarah, who is our head of GAMSAT and our section 1 and 2 tutor. So Sarah's just finished her third year, so MD3 at Monash. She's the brains behind all of our GAMSAT and our med interview programs, and she curates all of these GAMSAT experiences so that you guys can get the absolute most value. So she's honestly just so incredible. And as you're going to see soon, she just goes above and beyond to make sure that her students are supported, and not just with GAMSAT, but also just emotionally, you know, on the whole med entry journey. So if I could just get Sarah to just give us a wave.
Hi, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. So now just moving on to Vera, who is one of our section 2 tutors and also one of our essay markers. So Vera has just finished a completely crazy honours year this year in biomedical research. And she was actually one of the guinea pigs, so to speak, who had to sit the first ever online GAMSAT when the pandemic happened. So, you know, she knows all too well what the anxiety of sitting at GAMSAT online feels like. And she obviously did amazing in section 2, and she loves helping our students do the same. So Vera, if you could just say hi.
Hey guys, thanks for joining tonight.
All right. And last but not least, we have Keely, who is one of our section 3 tutors and particularly specializes in chem. So she's also finished MD1 at Melbourne Uni, and she's kind of our resident chemistry whiz at Halad. So she's probably the only person we know in our lives who actually enjoys doing chemistry. And she's just the best at explaining those things to people who kind of need to know, like, a good Chem 101 crash course. So Keely, if you can just give us a wave.
Hi guys.
All right, awesome. So you guys have the next 2 hours with our awesome tutors. So please just make the most of it, and definitely feel free to ask any questions that you have in the chat. You know, they'll be more than happy to answer anything that you've got to ask. Cool. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about the timing for today. So first of all, for each section, I'm just going to be sending through 2 links. There's going to be the question booklet and then a link for you guys to submit your answers. So we suggest that you open them side by side on your computer so that you can see both at the same time when you're answering. You have to make sure that you submit your answers by the timer ends so that they get included in our cohort results. The time is going to be up on the screen for each section, and the tutor for each section is also going to call 1 minute to go when you're almost out of time so that you know when you should absolutely submit. So at the time that each tutor is talking about their section, I'm also going to be sending a link in the chat to the cohort performance and the predictive scores for you all to have a look and follow along and kind of see how you're tracking. So for section 1, I'll send the 2 links and you'll have 15 minutes to answer 10 questions. Then Sarah's going to go through some explanation for each answer and discuss the cohort results. At this time, I'll also send you a link with the cohort results. And then for section 2, you have 20 minutes to answer 1 prompt. So again, I'm going to send 2 links, one with the prompt and one for you to provide an answer. So we obviously know that 20 minutes is not long enough to write a whole essay, and that's definitely not what we're expecting today. What we're really hoping to see from you guys here is probably the introduction and 1 whole body paragraph. And we'd also love it if we'd also love to see you use the planning space, because it's just really great practice for you guys to get in early on and to get the hang of just planning your essay and how to best do that. So for the feedback, our Section 2 tutor Vera will be reviewing and providing feedback for one of your essays, which will be selected at random. So if you're happy for your essay to potentially be reviewed, you're going to have the option to tick a box to say that and let us know. And then out of the people who do say that they're happy to have the essay reviewed, one of you will be randomly selected, and then anonymously the essay will be reviewed and given feedback for. So by Section 3, well, you guys will know the drill. It's basically just the same as Section 1. So I'm just now going to pass on to Sarah, who's going to sort of take you through the process for Section 1 and kick off the exam. So good luck, guys.
So just a reminder, I know Jules just went over it, but you'll be given 10 questions and have 15 minutes to do them. They're all multiple choice. And then afterwards, we'll go through an explanation. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat as you go. So I'll switch over to a timer for you, and then we can get started. All right. And thumbs up if we're ready. Yep, amazing. Okay, you can start. I will let you know when you have a minute to go. Great, okay, so I'm going to swap my screen share. And what we're going to do is I will get Jules on the back end. She's going to bell curve and sort of show you where everyone's results at. And while she does that, I'm going to have a chat through some of the questions, but also just generally give you a few tips and a few, I guess, starting points for these kinds of texts and give you a bit of an idea about Section 1. But just from having a look, looks like everyone's done really well, and which is good. I tried to put together something that was not super easy, but that was manageable and a good starting point for you. So if I just show you this really quickly, the median being 8 and an average of 7.5 out of 10, which is awesome. So I will go over some of the questions that you found trickiest, but also some general tips about each of the texts. So I'm just going to pull up. And also after this, we'll send out explanations as well to everything. So if there's something specifically you want me to go over, you can put it in the chat. But if I don't get to every question, you can also look over the explanations afterwards. So the first unit here, the first text, is a long-ish text, not super long, on introspection. So these kinds of texts are quite common, and they've been coming up more and more in the GAMSAT. These texts which are sort of stylistically quite factual, and they're about maybe a philosophical phenomenon, or they'll be about sort of an aspect of psychological processing, and it will be quite factual, but then you'll have to make inferences on it. These, as I mentioned, have been coming up more and more over the past couple of years, and this one's a nice one because it is quite straightforward, so it's a good entry level one. If you found it a bit tricky, then it would be good to have a look into texts that sort of go over certain concepts, such as philosophical concepts or mental concepts, because there are definitely more convoluted ones out there as well that you can get. So my tip with these would be that give it a read, and after you've read it, ask yourself what it was about and see if you can sort of sum it up in a nice sentence or two and see if you can actually explain it. So if after reading this, you couldn't really explain what introspection was, it probably means that you struggled to understand the text. Now, a question I get asked a lot, so I'm just going to answer it now, is should I read the questions first? Should I read the text first? And that really comes down to you and what works for you and what's best for you. So me personally, I like to read the text first, so that's what I would have done. But if you prefer to read the questions first, by all means do that, and then you'd be looking for some of those things as you read the text as well. So if you'd read question 1 first, then you'd be looking for an advantage of introspection as you look through the text. So the question that I wanted to go over specifically with you all, I think was question 3, because I think that was the one that people found the trickiest. Yes, and so question 3, there was an even split between options B and D. So let's have a look at that. And the question is, the condition of temporal proximity ensures that introspection. Now, this is asking about a particular part of the text. So if you'd read the text, then you'd remember that there are a few criteria that need to be met for something to be considered being introspective or someone engaging in introspective behavior, and that one of these is temporal proximity. So I know that these can seem like a bunch of words, and I think sometimes what happens when things are listed is people just take it and go, yep, step 1, step 2, step 3, and they don't consider each thing in its sort of on its own or in its individual case by case. And so this one here, mentality and first person and temporal proximity are 3 different components, and you need to treat them differently and see them as a whole picture, that each one needs to be met for it to be introspection. So that's just something important that comes up a lot in these texts, is they'll list things and you need to know what each thing is in the list. So this one here is asking about temporal proximity. And if we look here, the temporal proximity is specifically talking about that if something is to be introspective, it must be something that is current. So it must either be right now, the current thought process, or just happened, so the immediate past. I think that that's where this question became a little bit tricky, because it's saying that you need to meet this criterion, not just because it's a nice idea to meet that it was happening now, or not because, oh, I remember it, so it's easy to be introspective. It's with the backdrop of it needs to be relevant to the here and now, because that's the person's current state of mind. So introspection is all about someone's personal own current mind and their current mental states and processes. And if you'd understood that, then you'd understand why it's so important that this temporal proximity also exists. And so if we look at the options, the 2 that are probably the best contenders are these ones, B and D. So B being it's relevant to one's own current situation and not something that transpired in the future. And this one, it's indicative of one's current mentality and not their previous thoughts or events. Whilst both of these are correct, this one is more correct, or D, I would go with more correct, because it's the one that actually refers to why we don't count things which are previous. And the reason why is because it's not about your thoughts or events that happened in the past. It's about the here and now. Also here, something that transpired in the future just doesn't really make sense, because there's nothing in the text that talks about looking to the future or like being introspective about the future. And there's nothing there that suggests that being introspective is about like envisioning future events. So if this said and not something that transpired in the past and had that as the option, that would probably be correct. But because it's got future here, it's throwing you off a little bit there. So my advice with these kinds of questions, and this is very characteristic of section 1 questions, is that they'll put a few options that do look good and could theoretically be correct, which is very difficult when you come from a background where, especially if you come from a more scientific background and you come from a background where there's only one correct option and like one correct answer, and like if the answer is 1, then the option where the answer is 2 is obviously not correct. It's quite different in section 1, and so picking the most correct relies on context, and part of the context is looking at the text as a whole and going, what is the text as a whole trying to tell me and teach me and say to me? And in this case, the text as a whole is trying to tell you that introspection is about looking at what's happening in your mind at the moment and making decisions based on that. And so that's why D would be the most relevant here. Cool. All right, let's have a really quick look at question 2, because I think that also links in quite well to what I was just mentioning about the things to look for in the text. So the question 2 is, what does the concept of introspection indicate about human nature in the way that it's presented in the text? So the answer to question 2 is B, that the benefit of privately reflecting on mental well-being holds for humans. Now, there are 2 skills that I think are super important with these texts in section 1. One of the skills is finding evidence and finding the right evidence in the text. And that's also always the first thing that you should be doing when you're looking to answer a question. The next skill is extrapolating and knowing when to create inferences and take the text a step further. And that's really hard to know how to do, and it is a skill that takes time to develop and to practice. But it's one of those things that you do when you can't find good evidence in the text. And this is a nice example of that, because there's nothing in the text that actually says explicitly introspection is good for mental well-being and for reflecting and moving forward, etc. There's also nothing in the text that says anything about humans being overly critical or things about humans overthinking. So you really have to look at what the text has given you and ask yourself which of these options best reflects the messages that are being written and that are being given to me. So that's when section 1 also becomes quite tricky, when you have to make those inferences based on the information given to you. So in this case, that's why I say to my students, I need you to be able to sum up the text really well, so that then when you get questions like this, you know how to answer them. And so this question here, summing up the text in terms of, okay, so it's about introspection. Introspection is all about what's going on in our mind in the present moment. Okay, cool. I think I know what's going on here. And there are a few criteria given to me to help me know what's introspective and what's not. And then looking at the options here, I am better equipped to pick one that aligns with those things in the text. So I hope that helps. I've broken down this question a little bit more in the explanations as well for you that you'll get sent out. So I won't spend too long on the poem because it looks like you all did really well. I will say this poem was quite a literal poem compared with some of the ones you can get. Again, a nice easing in one. I will go over question 6 though. This is a fun one. So which of the following is a key literary convention in the poem? Now it's really interesting because I don't think that knowing how to pick out literary conventions is an important skill for you as a future healthcare professional. And I get quite annoyed that they still ask you these questions. However, the good news is that unlike most things in section 1, this is something you can actually learn. So if you struggle with questions like this, or if it's been a really long time since you've done something like English or high school sort of literary sort of nitty-gritty things, then just go and look up a few websites, look up a few things online and get some lists together, compile some ideas in your head of different literary conventions. We also go over these a lot in our Halad courses and make sure that everyone knows what ones you need to know for each section. So in this case, it's asking you to look in the poem which convention is important. Now, I do know that this question as well is a little bit unfair because there's a little bit of all of these in there. There's not as much rhyme, but there's definitely rhythm and it is quite song-like. There's also juxtaposition, like right versus wrong, black and white, those sorts of things. And there's a little bit of not so much repeating structure, but there is repetition in here in terms of saying the same things over and over. So I do understand that it's misleading in that you're like, oh, I can see all of them. What I tell my students though is that I want you to pick, or you need to pick the convention that is most crucial or most pivotal to getting the message across of the piece. So in this case of the poem. And so the message of the poem is all about being able to see truth underneath the layers of what's being shown to you and being able to see beyond. And that is being told to you through metaphors. So this whole segment here, so here down to here, it takes you on this journey through canyons and stars and mountains and the sea. It's not trying to take you on a journey of the earth or trying to show you different things that you can see in your life. It's taking you on a metaphorical journey. And that is to show you all of sort of the depths and layers of things, and that you need to you need to search for truth. And so because of that, it's the metaphor in the poem that makes its message so strong and makes its message come out. So my advice with this one is, if you don't know which convention it is because you just don't know conventions, that's okay, easy fix. Go and have a look and find out about those. If the issue was more, I didn't know which one to pick because I could see elements of all of those, ask yourself which one helps the most with the meaning of the poem or the meaning of the text. And ask yourself sort of, if it didn't have the metaphor, would that change it significantly? And in this case, it would. Whereas if it didn't have the repetition, they would just put something else and they could still have the same meaning there. And so that's why I would go with the metaphor being the strongest. Yeah, great question. In terms of, there's a question here, is there a guide to questions like question 4? Are we meant to look for a theme, a message, etc.? Again, like I mentioned, this one's nicely spelled out in the explanations document we'll give you. But definitely just a great rule of thumb is always looking for that theme and the message of any text that you get in section 1, because that will be your gold. That's what they want you to look for. And when they ask you questions like what's an appropriate name or title, or maybe they'd be what would be an alternate name for this, that's what they're looking for. Could you look for the key message? And in this case, it is nice because between the lines is actually mentioned in the text. Most of the time they won't be that nice to you, and they'll give you something that's not in there. But I also wanted to just really quickly mention that just because it says between the lines as one of the options here, if that wasn't actually relevant as the key message of the text, I wouldn't pick that one. Thankfully it is. It does match the key message, but if it didn't, then don't pick it. So that's a really good point to bring up, and great question. You should definitely be looking for the main theme and message. So we'll leave it there for that one. I just wanted to really quickly go over one thing with the cartoon. You all did fabulously with these questions, so I won't, let me just check. Yeah, everyone's done really well with these questions. So I won't go over any of the specific questions as such. The one thing I will go over is that it's really important to not neglect a visual image just because you don't have to read things. So I know that with the long text and the poem, it's like super great because it's nice to go through and actually go, okay, what's the message, what's the theme, what's going on? And then sometimes we can skip those steps with a visual text because it's like, oh, it's just there. I'll just ask myself what I think. I'll just answer the questions. Please, please, please still look at it and go, what is going on and what's the message? Because they will write questions to stump you, and they will write questions where you'll only get it right if you've actually asked yourself those things. So these are really great questions about it, but thankfully, they were quite intuitive. I think like you could have looked at the image and then answered them. You won't always be that lucky. So I would ask myself, what's going on in this image? What do I think the main message is? And for me, I think that the main message is that even though many people want things to change and want action to take place, it can be difficult to actually be motivated to be the one making and creating that change, and that we often diffuse responsibility to others, particularly when we're among the masses and we await someone else's action before we take action. And so that's sort of what I think that the main message and theme is here. And because of that, I can go into answering the questions with that headspace because I've asked myself what's going on. So you don't need to analyze them in so much detail that you're picking apart every color and every tiny thing, but you definitely do need to at least know this is what the message is here. So just before we finish up, I'm going to get Jules to put in the chat a link for you all to have a look at. And if anyone has any final questions about any of those, just let me know. I'll just really quickly tell you about our ebook, which we just released. So you can jump on that link that Jules just gave you all, and you can access our ebook. So all of us as tutors wrote it. There's a bunch of content in there for each section. We've written our sort of top tips, and then we sort of walk you through some content as well to show you how to apply those tips. It's a way for you to create your own study plan and how to approach your GAMSAT study, particularly in the summer break if you're preparing for the March GAMSAT. And that way you can use it as your own guide and your own resource as you go. And at the end, there's also mock exams. So jump on the link and you can get it for free, or you can give a donation to us of whatever you'd like. And we hope that you find it helpful. And we're super proud of it, worked really hard on it. So please utilize it. And so if that's all, I will pass on now to Vera to walk you through section 2.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I will just quickly share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. But just to reiterate the course of events for this section, we'll be allocating 20 minutes for writing. Then afterwards, I'll be using the next 15 minutes to break down the prompts. And by this point, I will have already selected randomly a mini essay that one of you will have written, and we'll go through that. We've provided one prompt, and you'll see that it's a task A. During your writing time, feel free to take the time to plan and write a mini essay. This can take form of an intro and one body paragraph, as Jules said earlier. But if you don't really feel confident about writing 4 paragraphs at this stage, you can do a mini paragraph. That's perfectly fine. Take it at your own pace. And in the chat box, a link was provided to you by Jules, I think, for you to essentially type up your response and submit it. if you are okay with us selecting your mini essay for live feedback, there's a box for you to tick, and this process is completely random and completely anonymous, and you won't be name dropped if your essay is picked. So take the opportunity to get some feedback. All right, I'm just going to quickly share another screen. Just a sec. There we go. That's our timer. Okay, all right. So the link for the task A quote should now be in the chat box along with the Google form. Fantastic. Thanks, Jules. And I'll start the 20-minute timer and you guys can start. Okay, and that's the timer done. All right, so the next 15 minutes we'll spend looking at the quotes individually and then also looking at the sample mini essay that's been chosen. Great, okay. So let me get up the, there we go, perfect. Okay, all right. So really quickly going into the prompts before we get into that sample mini essay. So as many of you have probably deduced, the main theme that's stringing all these quotes together is censorship. So there are some other sub-themes such as free speech, liberty, oppression, but these are all spoken about in the context of censorship if you actually read these quotes properly. And censorship is really, if I had to describe it, it'd be the deliberate suppression of ideas, language, images, and this is often carried out by authority bodies. And censorship itself is usually spoken about in a very negative way. But it's neither a good thing or a bad thing, like many things in life are. It just simply is. We've seen many examples in history and in literature where censorship completely got out of hand and stopped people from essentially living their best lives. But then we, on the opposite spectrum, we also have censorship of material that should be censored, such as like child pornography. And in these sorts of cases, censorship actually exists for a good reason. So just keep that in mind when looking at a set of quotes. In section 2, you are almost guaranteed to get a theme that has both positives and negatives. It just depends on how you look at it. So I'm going to go through all of these individually really quickly. And for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with GAMSAT and section 2, what I hope you'll realize is that these quotes tend to present different perspectives of the one overall theme. And that theme for us today is censorship. And being able to narrow it down to the main central theme is really crucial so that you're actually able to write an essay to the theme that they want you to. And look at these quotes as sort of a springboard for the development of the rest of the essay. So the very first quote is, censorship reflects a society's lack of confidence in itself. This quote speaks of why censorship exists in the first place, what to say about the way society works, and why is it that government bodies and private institutions actually instill censorship into society, because there's a lack of confidence and there's a culture of fear that the communication of certain language, certain images, certain information can get out of hand when in the wrong hands. And so censorship is a way to literally block that off and control it. So number 1 is very much about the purpose of censorship. Quote number 2, whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. This quote reflects on how language is very much a tool of freedom, of identity, and because it's a tool of freedom, manipulating the accessibility of language and basically stripping away those rights from people is a way to limit that freedom. So what this quote is saying is that free speech is equal to liberty, and essentially censorship is equal to imprisonment. And I just want to mention really quickly while we're on the topic of free speech, we've had quite a couple of students in the past mistake free speech and censorship and essentially use them interchangeably, which is almost completely understandable because the difference between the two can be difficult to describe as well. And I even like to think that they have a sort of bi-directional relationship. So free speech can trigger, as I mentioned before, a complete culture of fear, and censorship is a response to that. And as a result, censorship is a way to actually suppress free speech. So they're very interconnected. And if there's a quote that might confuse students into thinking that this essay should be about free speech, it would probably be this one. But before you start planning and writing your essay in the exam, just a tip to make sure that you just take that step back and double check that you know what the theme is. And don't just read the quote by itself, read it in context of everything else. Quote number 3, censorship is to art as lynching is to justice. Okay, this one might be a bit difficult if you don't understand what lynching or lynch means, which is basically a very archaic term for hang, as in to execute, to be executed by hanging, and execution is pretty much a worst possible outcome that you could get when in court. So this quote literally compares censorship in art to execution, essentially the worst possible state. Very negative way of looking at censorship. Quote number 4 says that all censorships exist to prevent anyone from challenging current conceptions. All progress is initiated by challenging, all progress is initiated by challenging current conceptions. Consequently, the first condition of progress is the removal of censorship. So I reckon this one's pretty self-explanatory. So censorship, by manipulating the way language and information is transmitted across society, basically limits free thought and essentially impinges a very fixed set of thoughts onto society, and as a result discourages people from questioning the status quo and questioning the preset identities that are pushed onto them. And the way to negate this is to remove the source of this issue altogether, which is censorship. Quote number 5, if we don't believe in free expression for the people we despise, we don't believe in it at all. Now, this is probably the most controversial quote out of the 5 we have here. This quote is basically drawing on the fact that it's very easy for us, just because of human nature, to support the speech of those that we agree with, people that we share the same sort of views with. But if we're to truly promote free speech as a real thing for everyone, this also encompasses those who we don't easily agree with, like people that would take advantage of free speech, people that would essentially exploit it. So free speech is free speech. That's what this quote is saying. And overall, what we have is 5 quotes, hopefully you can understand now, that all speak about censorship in different lights. And we've got sub-themes of free speech and challenging the status quo. And they're there really to help you develop some stronger ideas on your own in your own essay. And something to remember as well is, while these 5 quotes are here to serve a purpose of giving you some ideas, you don't by any means have to stay within the boundaries of what's actually given to you. That's the way that I used to actually kind of generate ideas, really new ideas, and prevent myself from getting tunnel vision when reading the quotes, was literally just read the quote, identify the main theme, and ask myself what I really know about the main theme. What are my ideas? What are my thoughts? What have I seen about it in my everyday life? And this way you actually end up writing an essay that's directed by your voice and your personality, and it comes off really well to the examiners. Okay, so that is the quotes. If any of that was really confusing to you, please do send a question in the chat box. What we're going to do now is look through the sample essay, which will be provided in a link below in the chat box. So we'll spend like maybe 3 minutes looking at it, and then perfect. Thank you so much for that, Jules. 3 minutes looking at it, and then I'll quickly just give some live feedback. Just a couple of questions. Does this mean we can agree or disagree with a view in the prompts? Yes, definitely. So you can definitely agree or disagree. And I think with anything, when it comes to any sort of idea, there's always a degree down to your perspective and what you've seen about it. One thing that I would like to say is, while you're writing your essay, you don't want to come off as overly opinionated. You want to present your arguments in sort of an objective way, a way where you're actually able to reason your views and be able to explain it properly to someone who might not be able to agree with you in the first place. But yeah, definitely can agree or disagree with the views in the prompt. You don't have to necessarily just follow what they say. Someone else asked, what if you don't have personal experiences with the main message being presented? That's a very good question, and that's completely understandable, because I feel like censorship's probably not as big of a thing nowadays. People might argue against that compared to in previous centuries. You don't have to have any personal experiences. You might be asking that question because task B is known to be more of a personal essay. And that's quite a misconception in itself. Task B is simply called personal because of the nature of the prompt that is given to you, but you can write it in a way that is completely impersonal. And that's usually what I do as well. So if you have any other like stories that you've heard like on the news, or if you've read anything When it comes to censorship, I feel like everyone always references 1984 by George Orwell, but like any book, any movie that you've watched, anything that you've read, works perfectly fine. Yeah, cool. All right, I think that's all the questions for now. But yeah, I'll quickly give 3 minutes to read this essay and then I'll dive into the feedback. Okay, so first impressions is a very well written piece of writing, and I think that this person, don't know who wrote it, but they obviously have a very good control of their language, and they are able to use language as a tool to effectively communicate their ideas, which is fantastic to see. And this is quite a considerable amount of writing in the 20 minutes, so this is really good to see. I think what I also really enjoy about this is I can see so much personality in this writing as well, and that's done through all the different sorts of examples that they've used that have spanned like different centuries as well, which is quite good. So we can see that this person reads a lot and is quite up to date with current global affairs, which is great to see. In terms of things that I think that could be improved on, I think that this is a body paragraph. It took me a second to realize that this is probably not an introduction. All right, so I would probably recommend making this particular paragraph be more geared towards censorship. Because from the very beginning, I wasn't quite getting as much censorship as I was more so like free speech. Yeah, and I think this particular paragraph, I feel like is talking more about censorship in the context of free speech rather than free speech in the context of censorship, if that makes sense. And you really want to make censorship your cornerstone of your essay. And something else that I would have recommended is probably this example of President Trump. I don't know if you guys remember, but he made some very, very sexist comments a while ago about this one woman. I can't remember what her name is anymore. But this is a good example. I just think that maybe making this a bit more geared again towards censorship and really having that come through, because reading this sentence, while written extremely well, I wasn't quite getting where the censorship was coming in from. And I think actually explaining that would be really great. But other than that, I think that this was quite good. And I love seeing stuff, especially when like you write about Australia. I think a lot of examiners would also really appreciate that as well. But yeah, I don't have any other feedback other than that. This is a very good piece of writing in the 20 minutes that was given. Okay, I'm going to quickly stop sharing. I think I got another question just then. Which prompt is this? I think there was only one prompt that was given. Correct me if I'm wrong, Liz. It was censorship. Yeah. Or as in, were you asking which quote were they actually addressing? I think they were probably addressing a mesh of quotes. And that is probably something that I would also recommend as well. Look not at the quote, not at like the particular singular prompt, but at the overall theme that this actual prompt is speaking about. Someone asked, do you recommend any book resources, books or websites to increase general knowledge / vocab, etc.? Okay, in terms of like resources, it really depends on what you think best fits your lifestyle, if I'm being completely honest. If you're not an avid reader, I would not recommend going to the bookstore and buying like 20 books, because realistically, you're probably not going to get through all that. I would recommend podcasts. Podcasts are a great way to get some information, and there are so many podcasts out there that cover a lot of scope nowadays. And I think it's super easy if you just go on a walk, just listen to a podcast. And there are some that are really good out there. I'm struggling to think of one right now, but there is one that I will probably comment on this chat box later on. One that like basically condenses down some really complicated concepts down to really easy, understandable knowledge. And Live also says our podcast as well. Shameless plug. Perfect. Someone says, I also thought we had to write about one quote. Yeah, technically you can, because each of these quotes technically do present a perspective. And if you want to make that like your overall contention or your overall main idea of your essay, feel free to, but you don't have to feel limited to. Someone else says, should we also be writing to time? For this session, 20 minutes is barely enough to get through a whole essay. and that's completely understandable if many of you guys didn't get to finish. Don't really expect you to, but yeah, you would like to aim to actually finish the essay in the exam. Someone says, will we get feedback on our essay / estimated mark? I think for the other essays, unfortunately not. We just picked the one that we would be giving the feedback on, which is this one over here. Someone says, would you recommend writing another body paragraph for this person? Okay, so this person wrote 2 body paragraphs. I would always write 2 body paragraphs, plus intro plus conclusion. I knew many other people who wrote 2 body paragraphs, and I usually wrote really thick ones, really dense ones, where I'd really unpack my complex ideas into smaller ideas as well. I don't think 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs will like automatically correlate to a particular score. It really depends on like the quality of your ideas. So if you can only think of like 2 ideas or like 2 main arguments that fall into like your major idea, then go for 2 paragraphs. If you can think of 3, do 3. Okay. Someone says, oh, so many questions. Oh, I love this. Okay. Is an introduction that is 2 to 3 sentences sufficient if relevant, or should we be introducing flow of examples in the introduction, i.e. setting up the line of contention in a more extended way? Okay, so I would personally probably go for 4 to 5 sentences for an introduction. That's probably just what I would do, like, but it really, really depends. You would probably want to do more than 2 sentences. What you want to do for the introduction is at least introduce the main theme. That's probably, there are actually 2 things that I always say. Whatever you do with your introduction, however you want to do it, it depends on the person. But one thing that you always want to do is introduce the main theme so that the examiner knows what the hell they're getting into. And secondly, your main contention / main idea. So the thing that's holding together your entire essay, you always want to mention that in your introduction. I mean, you can choose not to technically, but I mean, it's a really tidy way of doing things, because then you can see it in the introduction and see how it ties in the later paragraphs. And to follow on from that question as well, should we be introducing flow of examples? I would probably leave examples out of the introduction, put them in the body paragraph. Yeah. What sort of examples should be included? I real life examples / factual information you may know, etc. All of them. Like all the above, anything that you would like. I personally, it really depends on your interest as well. And I would actually suggest looking into your own interests. I personally love film and cinema, and I also love books and art. So stuff like that, I would always talk about. And the way that I would personally introduce, like in my introduction, how I'd introduce the actual theme is I would do it in a very niche way by like thinking of like a TV show that I watch, or a movie, or like an artwork that I can think of that reminds me of a theme, and like what it actually says about the theme, like if it carries like my central message. And that's what I'd usually do. So yeah. Okay, yeah. And someone says, do you have any recommendations on how to start writing essays? I would probably start with generating ideas and doing essay plans. I can understand that actually getting into the whole essay writing process is super overwhelming, and there's so much to work on. And I think actually working on the soft skills, such as like generating ideas, if that's difficult for you, finding more examples, or like reading up on things, if that's something that's troubling for you, or even just like, yeah, learning how to structure an essay and doing that through an essay plan. Like that's where I go about it. Take it slow, 1 step at a time. Abby says, can our examples be quite general if we want to say something but can't provide specific details, i.e. names, dates, etc.? Yes, they can be quite general, as long as you have the main essence of what you want to say about the example. You know, it's really funny because I have so many students write essays, and in their examples, they'll have like the most detailed example in the world. They have like the date, like down to like the absolute like 27 September 1973, and they'll actually say that, but then I'll read the example, and the example I actually got nothing out of. So we don't care about the small details. We want to get like the main essence, like how does the example actually contribute to the idea that you're unpacking? Hope that answered your question. And Lai says, how would you, like what mark would I give this out of 20? Well, the fact that it's a mini essay, so we'll negate the fact that there's no intro and conclusion. I would say this is probably a 16. 16 out of 20. Yeah, a couple of things to work on, as I mentioned before, such as just recentering the essay so that it's more focused on the main theme, which is censorship. Really easy to make that mistake, but other than that, it's very well written, very well directed, and it's got a lot of examples that are very relevant. Cool, I think that is pretty much it. So I'm going to quickly just reshare my screen. Hope I didn't take too much of the section 3 time. But just really quickly, I wanted to mention our section 2 essay marking service. So getting into the mind of a marker is something that's really important that we teach all GAMSAT students, and actually really understanding what markers are looking for is really important, especially for section 2, and actually understanding what they're looking for. So for me, when I was preparing, it wasn't about writing endless essays, but making sure that I actually got the proper constructive feedback from my tutors and being able to implement that into my next essay to make it even better. And our essay team basically has an essay marking service that anyone can use anytime. And it's really, really affordable. It's like $15 an essay to get it cross-marked by 2 examiners, and you'll get it returned within 48 hours. You can learn more about it, and I highly recommend using it through your preparation to make sure you're on track. So that's the link over there. I think Jules is going to pop it in the chat. Yep. But other than that, that is it for section 2. Any other questions, you can just private message me and I'll be happy to answer them. But we will move on, and Keely will be presenting section 3 to you.
Cool. Thanks so much for that, Vera. All right, I'll just start sharing my screen now. Okay, so we're going to go and we've got 10 questions set aside for section 3 to have a go at, which you'll have 20 minutes to do. They are probably slightly more challenging than the ones you had to go for section 1, and I'm just going to say that to preface to you now. They're probably questions that do require a little bit of prereq knowledge, not too much, and I think they're a really good example to show you guys that this is how, if they do expect you to have prereq knowledge, this is kind of like the upper limit of what they'll expect you to apply it for. So if it is a little bit over your head, or there's something that you're not quite familiar with, don't quite freak out. It is something that you can learn quite easily, but I think it's a really good example to show that it's not terrifying. They don't expect you to know ridiculous amounts of information. It's more about how you apply it. So that's all I've got to say for now. We'll give you 20 minutes to have a go at these questions, and then we'll go through them as a group. Let me just fix the screen. There you go, guys. Okay, so that's 20 minutes there. We'll now go through and have a look at some of the responses to these questions and how we can go about them. Before I just share the results, guys, I just want to reiterate, these questions are quite challenging, and I think it's a really good picture of what your end goal should be. At the moment, many of you will probably be quite early on in your GAMSAT journeys, so whether that means it can be a good idea of what you need to look forward to. So no, there's some certain areas I need to go back and revise. There's some certain scientific principles and things that I haven't covered yet that I need to get a really good understanding of. And then from there, think about how we can apply that to answering different types of questions and get to these really kinds of challenging ones like what we have in this situation here. So this is what the score looks like now. So as we can see, that it is quite low scoring, but that's okay. It is a challenging one. Do not be disheartened by this. As you can see, everyone is in the same boat here. We have made this quite challenging for you guys, so it gives you something to work towards. That's not what I want. What am I looking for? So if we go through here, we can see there's some questions that aren't particularly well done. Question 2 was done quite well. And then there's a few questions here where we have quite a bit of variation. As we can see, everyone's very much in the same boat here. For a moment in time, I think someone must have just submitted, we had an almost perfect histogram. It was so visually pleasing, made my brain very happy, very symmetrical. But we can see, yeah, it's been quite challenging. So as we go through, we can see that there's a couple of questions not particularly done well, the questions that have been done well, and there's a few options here where we can see that we've kind of been a little bit unsure of where to go. We've all chosen A, B, C, D. We've chosen all options. There hasn't been a clear kind of answer. So we'll go through how we've kind of narrowed it down and how we get to the correct answer for some of these. Cool. I don't really have too much to share on that. You guys will have access to this, I believe. You'll get your thing afterwards. Let's go to the actual questions though, because that's what's going to give us the best information.
This one over here?
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, Vera.
Oh, good.
Okay,
Okay. So just tell me wherever you want, like which question you need me to scroll
sure.
down to.
Okay. Well, we're just starting with the STEM for now. So sorry you couldn't see this question before when I was having my little rant. But this intro paragraph, really interesting, not at all useful. So we can put a big cross through it. We don't need to. It doesn't give us any valuable information for the questions that they're asking us for. Then we have this big structure, and there's a lot of things going on here. We can see there's lots of different chemical functional groups here. If we were to go through the molecule, we can see that we've got some ketone groups, so double bonded oxygens in there. We have an aldehyde, which is like a ketone, but it's on the end of the molecule. We have some hydroxyl groups and nitrogen groups. We've got some ring structures. We've got all kinds of fancy stuff going on. So there's a lot to take in, and I get that. But it's always good just to have a quick look, have a look at what functional groups you do have there, because they're probably going to ask you a question based on that. Functional groups are the interesting parts of the molecule. But overall, you don't need to take too much in at this point in time. It's more of a reference point to come back to when you're answering the questions. And if you just want to go down a little bit, Vera, the last bit of information we have here to dissect is our table. And again, there's a lot of words here, but basically what it is telling us is that we have a number of different tests that we can do in the lab. And we don't really care about what these tests, how you perform them, but we want to know what they're telling us, the information they can tell us about this molecule here. So if we start with our sodium bisulfite test, what it's saying is that by forming a crystalline precipitate, it tells us there's a carbonyl in there. So again, we can probably cut out half those words. If we perform this test and it's positive, it tells us there's a carbonyl group. The Schiff's test, I don't even know how to pronounce that one. Again, doesn't really matter. If we perform this test and it turns whatever color it's supposed to, it tells us there's an aldehyde there. So it's going to tell us a little bit of specific bits of information about this molecule. We've got a few others, so the feelings and the tolins will also tell us whether we have an aldehyde there. So they pretty much tell us the same bit of information. The sodium nitroprusside will tell us if there's a non-aldehyde carbonyl there. So that could be useful because if we think back to our molecule, we had some ketones there. That's got a carbonyl group in there, but isn't an aldehyde. We've also got a few ester groups in there. So that's going to tell us some information about those. Then we have a couple others here looking at general carbonyls and also specifics for a ketone or a secondary alcohol in our iodoform test there. So again, lots of information there, but it's something we can come and refer back to. We don't have to instantly kind of memorize it into our brain. It's something we can refer back to as we answer the questions. So let's have a look at question 1 here. So we're talking about what combination of tests will provide the chemist with the most useful information about the functional groups in carbamazepine. So we've got the structure there. We're very lucky. We've been given the whole structure of carbamazepine. We know exactly what's present there. But we've got to imagine that we don't. And we want to work out, okay, what's the most useful part of this group? These tests are going to tell us about some of the carbonyl functionalities there. So which combination of these tests will tell us the most about them? So we know this molecule has both it's got lots of carbonyl groups, but it has both aldehyde groups, it's got ketone groups, it's also got some other carbonyl groups like esters in there as well. So we want to know, okay, well, what's going to tell us the most about them? And if we go down to our options, that's when we kind of need to pay almost like a elimination. We want to eliminate all the options that aren't going to give us the most amount of information. So the first test here is looking at sodium bisulfite and tolins. So tolins is going to tell us if we have an aldehyde there. So that's going to give us a useful bit of information. That's pretty useful. The sodium bisulfite, though, that's just going to tell us if there's a carbonyl group there. An aldehyde is a type of carbonyl group there, so it's not really giving us any additional information. So it could be useful, but probably not the most useful one. If we look at option B, so feelings test is going to tell us if we have an aldehyde, and the sodium nitroprusside test is going to tell us if we have a non-aldehyde carbonyl group. Okay, so that's giving us a little bit more information than the first one. It's going to tell us about our aldehyde. It's also going to tell us that we have some other groups present as well. That's pretty interesting. C, we have a look at Schiff's test. Again, I think that one was an aldehyde test, just thinking off the top of my head. Yep, brilliant, it was. So it's telling us about that. We've got that group present. And the other option that we had for this one is that we're looking at the iodoform test. So this one can tell us that we have a ketone or a secondary alcohol presence. So again, it's giving us two kind of bits of information here. But I suppose we then need to decide whether option B that told us about the aldehyde and non-carbonyl group is going to be more useful than option C, option D, C, my bad, sorry, in this example here. And because the iodoform test is positive for either a ketone or a secondary alcohol, it's probably not going to be as useful because it's like, well, which one of these groups do I have? I could have either of them and it's going to give me the same result. Whilst for the first one, as long as you've got a non-aldehyde carbonyl, it's always going to be positive. So it's going to be a little bit more useful than this one there. So the correct answer for this question is in fact B. And we can go through with D as well, but the same kind of thing. It's going to give us a bit of repetitive information. We're performing more tests, but it's not really giving us more data or more intel about what functional groups are actually present here. So yeah, so B is going to be our most useful one. It's going to tell us the most about the structure of our molecule. Okay, question 2. Upon identifying that carbamycin contains both aldehyde and ketone functionalities, the chemist decides to add a reducing agent and follow up with one of the tests. So let's just think of what that's going to happen now. So we're adding a reducing agent into the mixture, and basically what that's going to do is it's going to get rid of one of our carbonyl functionalities. When we reduce a carbonyl functionality, we normally end up with an alcohol or some other kind of compound, but we lose that C-O-O bond. So it's going to change how we react in these tests, and that's what we want to find out. So given that the reducing agent is less reactive with aldehydes than non-aldehyde carbonyls, what combination will enable the chemist to identify how many of one particular functional group is present? Again, they've given us lots of information and there's lots of different test names here, so it can be really overwhelming. So we want to have a go, we want to work through our molecule. So the first thing to take note of in all our different options here is that each option has a different number of equivalents. And so what that means is that for one molecule of carbamycin, we need one equivalent to reduce one functional group here. So if I have 2 equivalents of my reducing agent, I'm going to reduce 2 of my carbonyl groups, get rid of 2 of those C-O-O bonds. If I have more, then I'll be able to reduce more of those groups. So the options they've given us here, they've given us 2, 3, 4, or 5 carbonyls, reducing group equivalents. So if we go up to our diagram here, and we have a look here, we know that our aldehydes are least reactive, so they're going to react last, and the other group's going to react first. And if we have a look at our structure, we can see how many non-aldehyde groups we actually have present. Can you scroll up for a little bit, Vera, so we can look at the structure? Thank you. So if we have a look here, how many carbonyl groups do we have that aren't an aldehyde? So we have one on the right here. We've got one at the very top of our ring. We've got one on the bottom left of our ring, our big ring, and one on the bottom right of our ring. So we've got 4 non-aldehyde carbonyl groups there. So if we want to see any change in those tests that test just for non-aldehyde groups, we need at least 4 equivalents there. If we start adding more beyond that, then eventually we will also reduce our aldehyde first. But because that's least reactive, it's going to be the last one of those groups to actually be affected. So now we can go back to our options and we can kind of eliminate them a little bit. So, okay, let's start at the bottom. I'm going to start with D and work my way up for this one because I remember what the tolerance test does more so than anything. So with 3 equivalents of the reducing agent, so we're going to get rid of some of those other rings, but we're still going to have our aldehyde present. If I then test it with the tolerance test, which is what test is for aldehydes, I'm still going to have that aldehyde there. It's not going to have changed. So it's not really going to tell me much information about it, is it? Let's look at option C. So again, I'm adding 2 equivalents here. So I'm going to get rid of some of those other groups, but I'll still have my aldehyde there. I will still have some of those ketone or ester groups there. If I then add the feelings test, which was looking at our, oh, good question. What was it? Looking at brilliant. Yeah, so Vera's got it up there. So if I'm now looking at my feelings test, we can see that it's for aldehyde again. So same as the last one, I'm still going to have that aldehyde present. So that's not giving me any information about how many groups I have present at all, because I'm going to have the exact same results before and after I do the reducing. What other options do we have for this one? So option B, if I add 5 equivalents of the reducing agent and then perform the iodoform test. Okay, so that's an interesting one because we said we had 4 non-aldehyde groups plus our aldehyde. So if I'm going to add 5 equivalents of them, we're going to get rid of all of our carbonyls. So our iodoform test, it's not going to pick up a carbonyl, but it also can be positive for a secondary alcohol, which we also have in this group. So a secondary alcohol is going to be one of our OH groups. And what it is, it's bound to a carbon that's also bonded to another carbon. So we've got a couple of those throughout. I think we've got about 2 or 3 of them in this structure. So even though we've gotten rid of all of our different carbonyl groups, we're still going to have those alcohol groups there, and it's still going to be positive. Nothing's going to change. It's not giving us any useful information whatsoever by performing that test. So that by process of elimination, that's kind of suggesting to us that A will be the answer, but let's just talk it through for logic just to make sure it is right. So if we add 4 equivalents, so that's going to get rid of all of our non-aldehyde carbonyl groups, and then perform the sodium nitroprusside test. So originally that test was looking for non-aldehyde carbonyl groups, so originally it would have been positive. If I then add 4 equivalents of it, it's now going to be negative, because we've gotten rid of all those groups, but we've kept our aldehyde there. So that's going to tell us that we've got 4 of these groups present in the molecule, and that's going to be a useful bit of information to help us determine, pretending that we don't know what the structure already is. It's definitely more of a complex, abstract kind of question. I think it's a really good one to have a look at all the different structures and have a go at really relating lots of different information. Certainly a challenging one, but if you can understand how we can relate this information in the table with what we're given with the structure, you're off to a really good start. Okay, question 3. I think this one was done quite well amongst most of us, and it's a little bit easier. Here we're looking at the different structures, and we're looking at mass spectrometry. So if you're not familiar with what that is, I suppose it's not the worst thing in the world. We don't need to know too much about this, but basically you put a molecule in this machine, it shoots lots of electrons and crazy things at it, and it breaks up into little fragments. So basically we're identifying out of these 4 fragments, which one is the least likely to form. So we actually need to consider our structure there, and I did have a diagram to show you, but I'm not going to be able to get that up with my computer being funny, but it's definitely in the answer, so you'll be able to have a look at that once we share the links of the explanations with you guys. But if we have a look in our molecule, options A, B, and D in this molecule are all actually fragments of our molecule, exactly as they appear in our structure. So if we go back up to our structure, Vera, if that's okay, I'm sorry, there's lots of scrolling for this question. So our fragment A was this middle ring with our nitrogen at the top here. It had our nitrogen and it had some of the side groups present. That's quite a likely structure to form, given that we can see it. It's right in the middle of our molecule. Fragment B that we had was also a chain that we had looking at the ester group in the bottom of the most bottom part of this molecule. Sorry, I'm really bad explaining this here. This ester group along here is actually what is presented by B. So we can see that if we just snip a little part of our molecule, that's the fragment that would form. So it's quite likely that we'd end up seeing that one. C, on the other hand, it looks kind of like something we have in our molecule in that we do have that little triangle with oxygen in the middle present. But if we have a look at the number of carbons and side chains coming off of it, we don't have this present. If I look to the left of this fragment here, 1 carbon away from the ring, there's 2 carbon groups coming off of it. And I don't have that anywhere in my molecule. In our overall structure, it's continued along in a linear kind of ring structure. There's no side groups coming off of it. So I'm not likely to form this at all. I don't know where these extra carbon groups are coming from. So I'd say C is the least likely to form. It's not something that's intrinsically in our molecule where we can just cut a little bit out of it and go, yep, that's a fragment that will probably form in this process. It's got some extra stuff added to it. Cool. All right. I know that's really content heavy. We have one more question for this one. We can move away from the structures a little bit more now. And we're looking here at some extra information they've given you. So that's another thing I'd like to do in the GAMSAT. They've given you all this information. They've gotten you to work out a few questions. Here's a bunch more of information for you to interpret and answer some more questions on. Very common thing for them to do. Now we're looking at the Pincis rule of 5 here. So talking about drug-like qualities. Again, we don't really care about that. We're more concerned about the chemistry in the actual question. They've given us a bunch of things here. So we can talk about log P, the molecular weight, and then hydrogen bond donors and acceptors in our molecule. And if they meet all these criteria, they're generally pretty good drugs. So it's a good classification way. So if we've got a random molecule, we go, oh, is this going to be a good drug, or is it going to fail miserably when we invest all our money in putting it into clinical trials? Something they like to know in advance. And our question is asking, which of these are not met by carbamycin? So first thing first, we know nothing about log P. It's told us it's one of the things, but we have no information on it whatsoever. So you can pretty much ignore that one for now. If they haven't given you any information on it, they don't expect you to work with it. There's other ways that we can work out what the right answer is. So don't freak out when you see something like that. A lot of the time, you can work the answer out just as easily using other bits of information that you do have. Number 2, looking at the molecular weight of the drug. So this is where kind of a little bit more of that prereq knowledge comes in. They're expecting you to know a little bit about molecular weight and know some of the basic atomic weights. So I think when I teach students, I say like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen are your bread and butter. In any organic molecule, they pop up. So it's worth knowing a little bit about them. If you don't know that, it's a little bit of a pain, but we can still work out the answer for this question. If we have a look at this molecule, it's a huge molecule. I did count it up at one point. I think there's like 40 carbons in there. Each carbon has a mass of like 12, I think is what we call it. So if I'm timesing all my carbons, so 40 by 12, that's going to be almost my 500 right there. But then have to add in all the different oxygens and all the hydrogens in there, we can see that this really big molecule is going to have a mass way over 500. So it's not likely to meet number 2. I'm going to say number 2 is one that's not met by this molecule. And then we come down to hydrogen bond donors and hydrogen bond acceptors. So hydrogen bond acceptors, I think, is the easiest one to understand. Basically, any really electronegative atom. So if you've got oxygen, you've got nitrogen, they're going to be your most common ones. They're going to be really good donors. This structure had heaps of them in there, way more than 10. So it doesn't seem to be meeting that one. And we also have our hydrogen bond donors in there. Donors is obviously a hydrogen. It's got to donate that hydrogen in the hydrogen bond, but it can't just be any hydrogen. It has to be a hydrogen that's bound to an electronegative atom. So we only have a few of those. We do have less than 5 there. So it actually meets number 3. So we don't know about condition 1. We said condition number 2, it didn't meet. Condition 3, it did meet. Condition 4, it didn't. So our correct answer for this one is C. Okay, that's a lot. I do understand. We had a question. I think we were talking about how hard the question. They don't order the questions from easiest to hardest in the GAMSAT. What they'll do is, like how we've done here, they have little units, and you'll have a few questions in each unit. Some units you'll naturally find easier than others. Others will be a bit more challenging. Generally, they're linked by the topic or something in particular. So like that last one, we were all talking about carbamycin. The second one here, we're talking all about myostatin and muscle signaling. So yeah, it can be a little bit challenging. You will find some easier than others, and within a unit on itself, you'll find some questions easier than others as well. How long per question? Good question. They've changed this recently, so I don't know off the top of my head. I think it's roughly 1.5 minutes overall per question, but you'll find that some questions will take you 2 seconds to answer, others may take you 5 minutes. It's a real big variation depending on how challenging they are, how much information there is to read before the question. Yeah, so it can be really definitely vary, but on average, I think it's about 1.5 minutes, give or take a little bit. Okay, so STEM 2 here, we're looking at myostatin. Again, we have a lot of information to do this. So they've given us a lot of information here. Always have a quick skim through it, but a lot of the time you don't need to take too much out of the STEM itself. Whenever you're given a diagram, they tend to focus on that one more. So we have our diagram here, and there is so much going on. There are so many different names and things. It's really crazy. So I would suggest having a quick look at this, but really go to your questions. That's going to tell you what molecules and things we need to identify here. So the first question here, we're looking at what is the likely function of the Mirth1 protein. I love how they have such funny names in these things. But our Mirth1, so we're looking within this little bubble down the bottom. It's representative of our nucleus. We can see that we have a Mirth1 being produced. but it doesn't have any arrows telling us where it moves or where it acts, whether it activates or inhibits anything. So that's what we're going to try and work out in this question here. So the first thing I think is really important is we want to know whether Mirth1 is active when we're making muscle, when we're building it up, or when we're breaking it down and catabolizing it. Because they've got two pathways here. One's going to build muscle up through our IGF pathway, and the other one's breaking it down through our myostatin pathway here. So if we have a look at our myostatin pathway, so it activates through our receptor. It then we have this goes through our SMADs, so these pink and purple ones here in the center-ish here, and they activate. We can see there's arrows pointing towards the line of our FOXO moving into the nucleus. So we can see that when this pathway is activated, we're producing this protein. And we know that myostatin is a muscle breaking down pathway there. So that's what is happening to do overall. And then again, let's go through our options and we can try and eliminate some. So option A, antagonizing the IGF-1 protein. So that antagonizing means it's doing the opposite of, or it's inhibiting the actions of, and we have no information to suggest that. There's no arrow pointing it to the IGF receptor. There's no information telling us that it moves out and binds to that receptor. We have no reason to suspect that that's the actual mechanism of action. B is the correct answer for this one. And we talked about it before, that it's active in muscle catabolism, so in that myostatin pathway. So it's likely to have some role there. C, it's talking about second messengers. And this one can be a little bit confusing, but I suppose if you're talking about a second messenger, they're things that have the same role and try to have the same function. And we normally talk about them in the cytoplasm. So a really good example of second messenger system is over on the left here in the MAPK activation part, and how we can see all these molecules, they're playing a role, they're signaling along, but they're ultimately all leading to that same effect. If we have a look here, it's actually a protein that's being produced in the nucleus. So it's a completely different thing. And if we have a look at FOXO, that's something that goes from the cytoplasm to the nucleus, whilst Mirth1 is being formed in the nucleus. So they're having different functions already. Last one, an anabolic hormone that increases muscle mass. So it's kind of a little bit of it's a little bit of an absurd answer, to be honest, because we've already said that it's active when we're talking about catabolism. So it's not going to be building up. It's not going to be undergoing anabolism at all. Okay, question 6. Now we move into our SMADs, a little bit of a funny name again, and we're kind of going to classify them now. And we've been given information about this in the STEM. We know our R SMADs are associated with our receptor, our I SMADs are our inhibitors in some way, and our C SMADs like to bind to our R SMADs. So very similar names, and there's lots of numbers to distinguish them, which can make it a little bit confusing, but all we have to do is have a look at our diagram. So if we have a look at our diagram, so again, we're on the myostatin side of it. If we have a look at it, we can see that our SMADs2 and SMADs3 are the ones that actually interact with the receptor. So straight off the bat, we can go, yep, those are our R SMADs there. They're the ones that interact with our receptor. And that's put in a nice lavender box in the center there. And we can see that from there, it then binds to a pink box, our SMAD4. So we know that our SMAD4 is going to be our C SMAD. It's going to be our one that binds to it. We then have to classify and work out what our I SMADs are. And we can see them, there's 2 points that different them here. We've got a SMAD7 inhibiting this process in the middle here. We also have SMAD6 and 7 up at the top at the receptor level. And we can see they've got the inhibitory arrows coming off them. So we can see very easily they're going to be our inhibitory SMADs. And so we have put that all in table form. That ends up giving us option D, with SMAD2 being one of the R SMAD, SMAD7 being the I SMAD, and SMAD4 being the C SMAD. I've said that word way too many times now. So let's move on to the next question. An antibody that neutralizes myostatin would have which of the following effects except? So here we want to have a think. If we've got an antibody that's neutralizing myostatin, we're decreasing those levels. We're going to have less of it, so we're going to have less of those myostatin effects. So it's going to result in a decreased inhibition of AKT phosphorylation. Well, that's true, because if we, in our diagram, we can see that there's a big inhibitory arrow coming from our myostatin signaling pathway to the phosphorylation of AKT. So we have less myostatin, we're going to have more phosphorylation of AKT. Option B, increased muscle mass via increased myogenesis. So that one's also going to be true, because in our diagram, we can follow along, and that when we have myostatin present, we inhibit those myogenesis genes being activated in the nucleus. So less myostatin, more myogenesis genes. C, increased muscle mass and IGF-1 synthesis. Okay, this one's a bit of a tricky one because we've got two parts in this one here. So increased muscle mass, that one's quite likely because our myostatin pathway decreases muscle mass, so less of that, you would assume we'd have more. But we have no information about IGF-1 synthesis. In fact, we have no idea where it comes from. It's just a random blob in the outside, for all we know at this point. There's no information leading up to it. So that part of it isn't likely. We have no information to suggest that. And option D, decreased activation of the activin receptor. So the activin receptor is what myostatin binds to. So less myostatin, it's not going to bind to the receptor as much. So our correct answer for this one is C. That one is not what we expect to happen. Cool. And I'll just quickly go over the last one here. I know we're getting really tired, guys. We've gone over so much content today. It's been a long night. Thank you for sticking with it. Which of the following drug classes would be promising in the treatment of muscular dystrophy? So we're talking about a condition here where you've got less muscle already. So we want to inhibit further muscle loss and hopefully promote some muscle growth. So myostatin analogues, that's going to do the exact opposite, because if you've got more myostatin present, you're going to have more of that muscle breakdown pathway. That's going to do the exact opposite of what you want. Activin receptor analogues. So this one's an interesting one, and it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but this is actually the right answer. Because if we're going to treat someone with a lot of this receptor, what it's going to do is it's going to mop up, it's going to bind to all the free myostatin and bind to it really tightly, which means it can't bind to its normal receptor and it can't stimulate that muscle breakdown pathway. So we're going to stop that from occurring. IGF receptor analog, that's going to do the opposite. So similarly, it's going to mop up all the IGF, which means that we're not going to get any of that muscle building pathway occurring. So that's not going to help us at all. And anti-follistatin antibodies. That one's also not going to be useful because at the very top of our diagram, we have a little bubble saying that follistatin normally inhibits myostatin. So if we're getting rid of that follistatin, we're going to have more uninhibited myostatin to break down our muscle with. All right, let's just smash out our last unit. I know it's a lot to cover and there's a lot of content in here, but we're so close now. Here, we're talking about an electron transport chain. But to make it a little bit more confusing and make it a little bit different to how you've ever seen it before, it's been written in a rather abstract way, because instead of having, all the regular proteins and pictures that you're used to thinking about when you think of an electron transport chain, we're being given just random arbitrary letters with values next to them. Doesn't tell us a whole heap about what's going on. So from our STEM, the main thing I suppose we get out of this is that it's a transfer of electrons. And in order for there to be a transfer of electrons, we need a redox reaction to occur. And that's what they've shown us in our little table here. They've shown us a bunch of different letters, or in this case, they're representing different proteins or complexes involved, and the E0 values. So here's where a little bit of that content and prereq knowledge comes in. Our E0 value represents how likely that reaction is to proceed in the forwards direction. So here we can see that they're all written in a reduction form. So they've gone W plus electrons into the reduced form of W, and it has a positive E0 value. A positive E0 value, the more positive it is, the more favorable it is. A negative E0 value is less favorable than a positive one. So we now need to consider what's going to happen here. And because question 9 is asking us, in what order are electrons transferred between complexes in the electron transport chain? So we need to think which one is going to be most likely to give off those electrons first. Because in order for an electron to be passed to the next complex, the first complex has to give those up. It has to undergo the opposite reaction, the oxidation reaction to what is being shown in our table in order to give those electrons up. So if we have a look at here, we can see that as it's written in our table, X has the most negative value. So it doesn't like to be reduced very much. It doesn't like to accept electrons very much, but it's very happy to give them off, because if the reaction's occurring in the opposite direction, the sign of the E value gets switched. So it becomes positive 0.320, whilst all our other ones have positive values. So they become negative when they're giving off those electrons. So X is likely to be our first one, and it's going to get those electrons and give them off first. And if we then follow in the order of getting the more negative, once we switch the signs, then we go from X to Y to Z to W. So again, that's where our prereq knowledge comes in a little bit there, understanding what those E naught values mean. Yeah, of course. Okay, so if we have a look in our table here, the E naught values they've given us are for the reduction reactions. So X plus electrons, so when it's accepting those electrons, it has a positive value. But the minute we talk about X giving away those electrons and passing them on to the next substance, the reaction's got to go in the opposite direction. So really, it's X with our arrow going to the other side of the screen into and releasing our electrons. So if we're switching the sign of the arrow, we've got to switch the sign of our E naught value to reflect that. Okay, last question. Let's smash it out. Which of the following electron transfer reactions is likely to be the most favorable? Okay, so which one is going to be the most favorable? We talked a little bit about this, about half reactions before, whereas the more positive it was, the more favorable it was. Now we're going to talk about it in overall reaction. So in order for these electron transfers to occur, we need one of the substances is going to give off the electrons. We also need something else to accept those electrons as well. So we need to consider both of the values that we are given. So we kind of need to go through and do a little bit of math. Very, very basic. Addition and subtraction. That's all there is, I promise. It's not too bad about each of these opportunities here. So if we talk about option A, for example, so we're talking about W giving off the electrons. So W is being oxidized. And if we look in our reaction here, in our table here, W has a positive 0.516, but because it's giving off those electrons, we need to flip the sign. So it's going to be negative 5.16. And then it's giving them to X. And X is going to be accepting those electrons, so it's going to be in the reduced direction. So X has a value of negative 3.2 for that one. So what we do is we add those two together. And so that gives us a very negative value of negative 0.836. So that sounds very unlikely. So that's not likely to occur. That's probably not going to be a very favorable one. And we need to do the same thing for each of the options as we go forward. And I'm not going to do it for all of them. I will go through it for the correct one just to make sure we're all on the same page. The correct answer for this one is C. So we're going from X to Y. So in our table, X has a negative value, but when it's giving off those electrons and when it's going in the opposite direction, we switch that sign. So we have positive 0.32, and we're giving those electrons to Y, which has a value of 0.15 when it's accepting those electrons. So we add those two together, and it gives us a value of 0.471. And that's the highest and the most positive value of all the different options there. And so that's going to be our most favorable reaction. Okay, guys, awesome work. I know that's a lot. I'm sorry that did go on for a little while. I really hope you understand, though, that these are some of the more challenging questions. So if there is something that didn't make sense, feel free to shoot a message in the chat and I can help explain it a little bit better. But also don't feel disheartened. These were really challenging, and it's definitely something to work up towards as you build up to your GAMSAT. It's quite a while for the GAMSAT. You've got lots of time to get some experience in working with these questions to help you out there. Just while we're waiting for the screen share to actually come up so you guys can see it. So now that you've had a taste of Section 3 content, we generally find that there's two types of students at this point. Students who are like, yep, I feel pretty confident with this, I got this, and others who are kind of freaking out going, oh shit, what have I signed up for? And that's totally okay. You can ask any of us tutors, we've definitely all been in that, oh shit, what am I doing position at some point or another. So it's totally okay for you to be there at some point. It's more just about developing a plan to move forward about how you can get to that phase of like, yep, I'm confident to sit this exam. Section 3 is kind of one of the odd parts in that you've got prereq knowledge, which you don't for the other sections. And if you don't come from a strong science background, or even if you do and you're just not particularly confident with how to translate that science knowledge into answering the questions, then we always recommend that students take the Section 3 this, it's not section 3, we have it for all sections, but the 3-week head starter course from Halad before they then move into any of our intensive courses. So these is really looking at all the different content that we cover and kind of skills they expect you to have already, and then we move into our 6-week head start intensive course later on, which is really about applying that information to how we can really answer the questions right. The course is nice and short. It's only 3 weeks, and it's really focused on the scope of content of what you need to know. And so that's really useful for section 3 in particular, about some of the main areas that they expect you to know about, but they don't really tell you in detail. I'm sure the girls will talk about it a bit later, but we've made it really, really affordable. It's like under $100 or something for this course, and you get complete access to all your tutors, and they'll help you explain a whole bunch of stuff. And Jules will put the link in the chat so you can learn a little bit more about our 3-week Head Starter course.
Doing those questions tonight. So for our courses at Halad, we really like to emphasize sort of reflection and reflective learning, because, you know, it's always a really good idea to, once you've kind of learnt and spent some time studying, to go away and really have a think about what you've actually learnt, so that, you know, next time when you go back to do the next activity or study some more, you really know what you want to get out of your next session and kind of like what you want to focus on. So can I please get everybody to type something in the chat that you think you've taken away from today? And I'll just give you guys a couple of minutes to think about that now as well. All right, so thank you guys for sharing some of that. And, you know, we're just really glad that you came along, and we hope you got a lot out of it. So whilst you're kind of still having a think about that and popping all this in the chat, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what's next from here and how we can support you the best in terms of you going into the March 2021 sitting. So I'm just going to send some links in the chat now for you guys. I guess first of all, make sure you join our Facebook study group, because we're going to start posting so many free resources on there to help you. We've also got our Facebook page, so make sure you like that so that you can get notified when we launch new, you know, global health events, new podcast episodes, any volunteering opportunities on our missions, and so on. And finally, just to see all our upcoming GAMSAT events, resources, and courses that we've already got lined up for the lead up to March 2021, make sure you check out our interactive calendar, because that's got everything on there for you as well. So now I'm just going to pass on to Eliza, who can tell you a little bit more about our Head Starter course for anyone who's really keen to get into some serious study and preparation over the summer. So just over to you, Eliza.
Cool. Thank you so much. I totally reiterate, Jules, I don't think anyone is on Keely's level at a 9 p.m. for section 3 chemistry. That was insane. But as Keely said, sort of what we really like our students to see is follow the you know, the recommendations that our GAMSAT tutors have made, because we definitely know that the method does work. And essentially, as you can see here, students like Mark, who has come through our last GAMSAT cohort, scored 80 on his first time. We have students like Pravind, which Jules showed before, who was improving 20 points on his second resit. And it's really through doing the recommendations that the tutors have given, and that is to do the Head Starter course and then go on to do what we have as a more intensive course called the 6-week intensives. That course is toward February of next year and has now been improved for the March 2021 sitting to be a lot more advanced and to be a lot more about exam strategies. And what we have done is taken out essentially all the content learning from there and put it all into these 3-week head starters. So really the tutors would want to know that you guys know all the presumed knowledge that is content focused from these head starters before you go in and sit those 6-week intensives. So to give you a bit of an idea, essentially what it is you're going to do 3 weeks. It's 2 hours of online class with a tutor. You can pick whatever tutor you want. You can have Vera for section 2, Keely for section 3, and beyond that, hype train. And you'll have 2 hours of classes per week. It's a max of, I don't know, like 10, 12 students per class. And it all starts from $99 per 3-week Head Starter course when you sign up with a friend, and that starts on December the 1st. So whenever you do sign up with a friend at Halad, you do both get a 10% off discount, and all you need to do to get that is email our ops manager, Khalid, because what we do find is that every student who enrolls with a friend and gets that extra motivation to do it together does so much better. You know, it's not a statistically significant improvement, but it's fair enough for us to say that it does work when you do sign up with a friend. And I guess the last thing from here is that for you guys who've really taken, 2.5, 3 hours out of your day, you guys are the ones who do invest your time into making sure that you do the best that you can on your GAMSAT. And the only way we can say thank you for your dedication is that for any student who will be signing up for that Head Starter within the next sort of 48 hours, what we'll do for you is cross-mark one of your full Section 2 responses completely for free. It's what Vera was talking about before. We have this essay marking service, and you get it cross-marked by 2 tutors, and then you get it returned within the next 48 hours, and that usually is $15 per essay, but you'll get it completely free when you sign up for our Head Starter in the next 2 days. And for everyone who's watching this on the recording comes out a day later, so you will only have 24 hours if you choose to sign up then. From there, what we'll do is if anyone has any other questions, which I can see there are a few GAMSAT related questions, we're more than happy to answer any questions that come up. So pop them in the chat quickly now. I know there's already one question, and just for the viewers at home, the question was, can someone find it? What scores do you need in each section to be competitive? That's one question. Does anyone have any insight on that?
Keely's going to answer that question, or?
Sure. I suppose it's a bit of a challenging one, and I think no matter who you ask, you're probably not going to get a straightforward answer, and that's because it definitely varies from uni to uni. Every uni ranks differently when they go for their med things, whether they have an interview, whether they rank that higher than GPA and GAMSAT, whether it's a portfolio uni, or even just the different unis. Some of them use your overall GAMSAT score, some of them average them out, so Section 3 isn't weighted, so it varies hugely. I'd say, I think for most unis in the mid-60s is pretty good, and it's quite competitive. But again, it's going to vary hugely depending on so many other factors that it's up to you to kind of set your own goals about what you think is going to benefit you, about where you want to go and where you want to study medicine, and how you actually want to go about that.
Awesome.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, I think like for each section, I think at the end of the day, it kind of comes down to like the average score that you get for many unis. But anything above, I'd say a 60 to 65 in Section 1 is considered really good, because Section 1 is just an absolute killer. Section 2 and 3, I think anything above 70, what do you reckon, Keely? 70, 75, those are considered good scores.
70, 75 is like pretty damn amazing for those sections. You're doing amazing.
Yeah.
Terrific. Cool. Thanks for answering that. Someone asked for Keely, is this basically Section 3? Was that the question? The question was from Hanish, is this the typical Section 3?
They're definitely harder questions, so you'll definitely expect to see a few questions like that. They're not all going to be like that, though. We didn't mean to scare you off, I promise. It's just happened to be how we selected the questions without realising quite how that they were all hard questions. But you will see some like that, not all of them.
Cool. I'm sure Keely just wanted to put the hard ones in for you. For Zachary, the question was, with the Head Starter classes, what time of day do the classes usually run? So Jules has put a link into the learn more about that. If you open that link, there is a timetable on there, but generally we have classes running from Tuesday to Thursday from 5 to 7 p.m. and then Keely runs an extra class from 7 to 9 p.m. for Section 3, because we all know she is hyped at 7 p.m. And then we have a weekend class on Saturday, which runs from 10 a.m. all the way till 5 p.m. So you have those window blocks to play around with for your time. That's all in Australian time in case you're zooming in from the UK. The next question, are we going to be emailed the answers? Yes, you'll be emailed the answers tomorrow. Next question, Vanessa, will there be any pure content questions such as anatomy?
No, they don't expect you to know any of that stuff. They really don't care if you know that. They can teach you all that in med school once you're in. They more care about how you apply basic science information.
Terrific, cool stuff. That I think brings us to the end of our questions. Lastly, Sarah's internet completely crashed, so she has to apologize. And she said if you had any questions for her, feel free to email her. It's just sarah@haladtohealth.org. And also for anyone who is watching this on the recording. lastly, thank you so much to all of our tutors, and thank you to Jules for operating this as well and making it so seamless. I think I can say on behalf of everyone who has come tonight, you've really brought so much value, and it's always the most valuable thing for students to be able to see. So if you guys could leave in the comments below any feedback you had for our tutors or Jules or anyone, they would love to be able to see that. And as you exit on your way out tonight, we're just going to play a quick video of some advice that Mark, who we were talking about before, who scored 80 on his first time sitting, left with us and would like to share with the cohort. So feel free to stay around for that. Otherwise, we really do look forward to hopefully seeing you soon at our next FREE event or in one of our courses, and have a good night.
I did my honours at Melbourne. This is my first time sitting the GAMSAT. Mid-60s to low 70s. I thought, look, if I could get 70, I'd consider that, I'd be happy with that. Because I really did work hard on this. And then, yeah, when I got 69 section 1, 79 section 2, 86 section 3, and overall 80. 80, I was pretty full. It's like, I think, I don't think exactly how it translates to percentiles, like the high. So I was pretty wrapped with it. So yeah, so I ended up doing all 3 of the intensives and like 6, 7 practice exams with you guys, so like a ton of stuff. It's kind of crazy how cheap it is, to be honest. It's like less than $1,000 for just an absurd amount of content. Even if people feel like maybe they don't necessarily need it, which there were some things where I needed more than others. It was very nice to have accountability and break up, the monotony of study. And it's also really good to share ideas. Like I think, it's like I came from a bit of like a bubble of like education and family, and I think especially for section 2, like it's really important to get those different views because I think especially coming from sort of private school background, and that's not really like the views that a lot of guys would talk about there. Probably the things that they're gonna read that to prove it legit. Like I think the biggest thing is one, you have confidence that people who've actually done it before and successful and it's been through the process that you've been through, and I think it's another thing they can understand what you're going through as well. And I found with you guys especially it was comforting. I never felt like it was a cash grab, especially if you look around for information on GAMSAT and services. A lot of it feels like a cash grab. Yeah, like you guys went on organisation, like, and I think that was a really cool thing. It's like, and you can see it from like these are people who genuinely want people to get into medicine, and like that was like, it's actually, I think it's kind of changed my thought process. Like if I were to get into medicine, I would definitely want to be like that, as opposed to like everyone's fighting for the spots, like stuff you guys. I'm not gonna, I want to get it, not you. And so I think that was very comforting. So I got to give you a shout out to Prim as well, man. It was a good man. Although he made his pass for a gym junkie, and he never really gave me any good like gym advice to me. We never really broke the ice on that. So